So, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are only a little bit away from being released, and if you check online... Honestly, it's not as bad as Sword and Shield's pre-release hoopla. Sure, you're getting a few people who are pointing out technical flaws that don't really matter at the end of the day, but in comparison to people talking about minor things about how genders were swapped out for styles, which not really, since your type of style will still determine what pronouns the games will refer to you as far as I know. Or how about the fact that Pokemon trainers will no longer challenge you straight up and the player needs to be the one to initiate those battles. I'm not a big fan of that myself, since from what we've learned apparently, level scaling won't be a thing in the game. So if you go back to face the trainers, they won't be really worth your time. Over the course of the years, there's been a lot of changes in Pokemon, some good and interesting, others that I dislike, and of course choices that a lot of people disagree with. But if you can read the title of this video, I want to pose a question to you all. Has Pokemon lost its soul? Hi, MangaKamen here. Before we begin, we need to establish something before we can answer that question. What exactly do I mean by soul? You hear it all the time. This game franchise lost its soul. There's no heart in this music. They're nebulous terms, and ones that, while I don't mind using myself, they require some sort of clarification when you use them. Something that a lot of people don't do most of the time, and thus allows them to fall back on ambiguity, meanwhile allowing them to actually seem like they're saying something insightful and meaningful with their criticisms, but as it turns out, it's just a phrase to manipulate emotions. When I use the term soul or heart when it comes to games or media, like with Pokemon, it's when you can feel that there's passion and drive behind the project. Or to put it another way, you can see the vision that the developers had with the game. This, to me, is why Generation 1 of Pokemon is so beloved. Not just because it's the first generation of Pokemon, but because it also probably had some of the most passion behind it, arguably. I will not be the first person to say this, but the first Pokemon generation was inspired by bug catching, and more specifically from Satoshi Tajiri's childhood hobby of collecting bugs. In fact, one of the concepts for trading was imagining that a caterpillar was crawling through the link cable. It took about 6 years of development for the first generation of Pokemon to even be created, and you have to remember that the Game Boy was considered to be outdated hardware at the time, and yet, to this day, Pokemon is a juggernaut of a franchise. It was a mix of a perfect storm that the original Pokemon games were so popular, due to the time period, the marketing, the social aspect of the games, the cute creatures themselves, etc, etc. Hell, another thing I'm sure I'm not the first person to say next is that Generation 2 was said to be the last generation of Pokemon. As such, it had a lot of elements that would be showcased in that, such as getting back to Kanto, seeing what happened to characters in the first game, and of course, battling the previous champion, aka the previous player character. There was an air of finality here. Obviously, as I'm standing here, I realize that the statement of the final generation of Pokemon is almost ludicrous to talk about now. Like, at the rate Pokemon is going, I doubt that even in my meager lifetime that the series will disappear. I believe that it was the passion and hard work that was poured into the first two games, despite their numerous flaws and design choices, what really got people into the world of Pokemon. Now, almost 30 years after the initial games were released, it's hard to see the humble beginnings of this juggernaut of a franchise. And with it comes a lot of, well, I suppose the best term here would be rust on the series. Now, I enjoy playing Pokemon. I truly do, because the game mechanics and party customization is something that not a lot of games back in the day, and quite possibly arguably even today, don't hold a candle to. I mean, how many games can you really say you can choose what your opponent hits? But let's not kid ourselves. For a series that's based upon evolution, there's a bit of a stagnation with the series, and that can easily be used to showcase Pokemon's lack of soul, as it were. Repetition is something that can be draining, especially over a long course of time. With the exception of Sun and Moon and the Ultra counterparts, the games often hold the same basic formula. You're a young kid who's going to travel the region, beat the gym leaders, get the 8 badges, thwart an evil team, and find the legendary Pokemon, and beat the Elite Four. Now that is a massive generalization on my part. I'm going to be upfront on that. And it's a bit unfair since there's a lot of differences between the generations. For a franchise that's almost 30 years at this point old, you're going to have a lot of ups and downs in it. And it's the same thing that happened with, like, say, The Simpsons, a series that I kinda got turned away from and come back every once in a while and somewhat regret it too. Pokemon's a little different, and I think that part of the reason people will say that Pokemon is soulless is due to a few things. The lack of experimentation in the amount of games coming out. For this portion of the video, let's make a comparison to the latest two games that have come out, the remakes of Generation 4 and Legend Arceus. Now, I'm gonna be completely straight here. I'm not a fan of Generation 4. It's not the worst generation for me, that's Gen 6. But I had a lot of problems initially, and since Pokemon has for the most part done a good job remaking the previous generations, it's only natural to want to update the games for a new audience. I wasn't a huge fan of Gen 2 in retrospect. Pretty much the only saving grace during that generation was Giraffes, my boy! But Heart Gold and Soul Silver really did a good job of making me appreciate the games, even though there are still core issues that I have with the original games that are still present in the remakes. So the Gen 4 remake should have done the same thing, taken the original package, slap a new coat of paint on it, make some improvements, and update the games for a modern audience. So did it do that? I know there are times where I'm seen as the guy who defends Pokemon a bit too much, and some people have effectively labeled me as a shill, even though I've highly criticized Pokemon in the past. But these remakes? They're just not what I'm looking for. They're probably the worst that modern Pokemon can offer. Sure, they have things such as removal of HM and trainer customization, things that do actually improve the experience of the original games. But they don't do a whole lot to improve the Gen 4 games, since a lot of the Pokemon teams in the original Gen 4 games remain the same, save for moves and strategies and even abilities at times. And visually, I mean, in battle it's not bad, but the overworld isn't great. Now, some people like it. I don't personally. To me, these are the weakest looking games in Pokemon's history. They're the closest to what I'd call soulless in Pokemon, because while I can appreciate the want to have a straight up remake, Fire Red, Leaf Green, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, Omega Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire, they've proven that remakes can be done pretty well for the most part, and while having the same basic story as the original, still manage to bring something new to the table. For better or worse. At least they allowed the newer Pokemon that were introduced to be used in them in the same generation. Not so much with BDSP. In contrast, we have Legends Arceus, a game that I've talked about in length on this channel a couple of times, and it's a game that not only shakes up the formula of the series by drastically changing how you catch Pokemon and interact with them, but you also get to explore the world you're given in a much better way than normally. Tons of people fell in love with the game, and despite its shortcomings in the graphics department, it easily made a lot of players happy with the gameplay. I mean, it has a much more engaging system where you have to hide, aim, and determine quickly what items you want to use to catch the Pokemon. It's something that you as a player has to actively engage with, something that Pokemon, to be honest, hasn't really done in a mainline game before. Now, this isn't to say that Legends is perfect. It's got its issues too, but people are willing to overlook these flaws in the game and see it as a breath of fresh air for the franchise. To me, these games are on polar opposites when it comes to how to make a soul-filled Pokemon game. The remakes are probably the worst example, meanwhile Legends shows the potential that Pokemon has as a franchise. So, now that I've explained this and given my own personal thoughts on it, where does this leave us? Well, considering my timing and knowing how well my editor works, wink wink, I'm willing to bet we're about probably a week before Scarlet and Violet are released, maybe even less than that, depending if I recover from my sickness. To be frank, I'm getting the games. I'm sort of hardwired to get them at this point because it's tradition, but regardless, I find myself being mixed about them. On the one hand, there are significant changes being made for the games that I find to be positives, such as being able to tackle one of the 3 storylines at your own pace, Pokemon appearing in the overworld, having an auto battle system for wild Pokemon, as well as including a much better social aspect of the game where you can link up with friends and play with them. I can already tell my girlfriend is going to want to do a date night with this game. But by that same token, there are changes that I don't care for, like how you have to engage trainers on your own terms. I don't care for the school motif going on. I don't like the main character designs that we're getting younger kids. Again, where does this leave us? Does Pokemon even have a soul to it anymore? To me, it's an interesting question, and I want to give you guys my perspective a little bit more before I turn to you guys and get your own answers. I've been with Pokemon since its inception. I remember the first night that I ever picked up a copy of Pokemon Blue, and on a cold night that I got home, I spent all night with my Game Boy Color playing it. I had a flashlight in my mouth, I was under the sheets so I wouldn't wake up my parents, I had headphones plugged in, I had the works. I played until dawn, collecting the first 4 badges, mostly because I was a little kid who was trying to catch as many Pokemon as I could, building up my team. That memory will probably be with me for the rest of my life. And as time went on and more Pokemon games and monsters were introduced, my love for the series grew as well. The games would show me interesting worlds and creatures. I was a kid who was growing up alongside the roster. It was amazing at the time. especially when you would talk about rumors on the playground. That being said, as I grew older as well, my horizons grew. I played many different games. I played with different themes, characters, monsters, and was exposed to several different kinds of genres and such. Pokemon, for all my love and admiration for it growing up, had dulled due to the fact that I had a lot more experience in the gaming world. That being said, Pokemon still has a place in my cold, deep, dank heart, and I'll find myself looking for fan-made content or going back to some of my favorite games like Generation 5. To me, Pokemon didn't lose its magic or soul. Rather, I had lost the marvel of a world like that. And sure, I have my issues with Pokemon. I have a ton of videos on this channel that talk about my issues with the games, both as a game, a franchise, a story, and how they treat their characters at times. And yet, I still see that charm that was in the original games. Sure, I feel like the designers of modern day Pokemon are doing something wrong with how they're catering to an audience that wants to get through their games as quickly as possible, but I can see that there's passion and drive. I can see that in the designs, I can see that in the world, I can see that they're willing to do it because they managed to put these games out so quick. And if you're not able to have some sort of passion for that, then I find that to be rather sad. I can appreciate the attempts at shaking up the formula for the series, stuff like Mega Evolution, Gigantamaxing, and the latest being Terrestrial forms. I'm not even sure if I pronounced that right, but I don't care at this point. But by that same token, I feel like their experimentation at times can be the biggest detriment to the series. If you want an example, look at the GTS. It's probably one of the better aspects of Gen 6 games, with the player search system, where trading was made super easy and convenient, and when compared to the system that we had in Sword and Shield, well... Pokemon will arbitrarily include and then subsequently remove aspects of their games that can be positive. I understand it makes the games more unique, but when it's things like the GTS that have essentially become obsolete years after the older games are made, it makes it weird not to have these inclusions, especially when they replace them with more inferior versions of the same mechanics. I personally didn't like Mega Evolutions when they came out, as to me they came off as closing out the potential that a lot of Pokemon have for new evolutions. Because when they came out in Gen 6, the only other time we had evolutions for prior Pokemon was Generation 4. In contrast, I've fallen in love with regional variants, especially since they've improved upon the concept by giving them additional evolutions too. It takes an older Pokemon design and adds a new spin to them, allowing a chance to get back into the limelight as well as retouching on some older designs. Plus, for Giraffe, I will defend this beautiful creature and no one will stop me! Regardless, well, Pokemon definitely has lost some of its charm over the years, some of its marvel, some of its soul, and it just so happened to occur when the franchise decided to go full-on 3D. I still find some love within the series. If I didn't, I wouldn't be making more and more videos about the franchise. I wouldn't be criticizing it. I wouldn't be giving it props. I wouldn't be putting my time and effort into these games. They're not perfect. As a gaming franchise, as a business, it's not. But if it was, I'd probably find it to be boring. The franchise is in a weird place right now, and I can only hope that Scarlet and Violet are gems that can shine as bright as the stars in the night sky. I think pretty much everyone who's an actual fan of the series wants that, and not just want to see as many possible issues with the games as a mean of capitalizing on a trend hating on the games. I mean, I ain't gonna say it ain't lucrative to do that, but it sure as hell can be annoying, and it certainly has made people who are fans of Pokemon a fair bit more jaded nowadays. So again, I must ask, has Pokemon lost its soul? Well, that's a question I want to pose to you guys, my audience, and those who come across this video to answer. I mean, that's what the comments are for, right? If you disagree with my position and thoughts, that's always a fun thing to argue about. Or if you just want to give your own thoughts on the question, I urge you to speak up. And not just in comments, I want you guys to respond with videos or bring this up to friends, talk about it on social media. I feel like a topic like this needs to be talked about more thoroughly. Of course, if you don't want to leave a comment like that, just put the comment, I love Giraffe! Giraffe supremacy forever!
I love giraffes.